Licht aus, lights out. Thanks to everybody for coming and for letting me come speak about myself, which I've been doing quite a lot in the last month or two. I've been kind of on this little whirlwind tour of cities in the United States that I never was at before. Chicago, I've been to once before, so I'm happy to be back. And I realize I've made a presentation that largely speaks about a series of work that falls under the workshop header Volksboutique, which you'll learn all about. But I also realized that when I've been giving quite a lot of preface to the Volksboutique story, and I don't really have too much visual accompaniment to that. So in lieu of that, I'm giving you a picture of Thomas J. Watson, who's the founder of IBM. Which is conveniently headquartered in my hometown of Binghamton, New York. Can you hear me? Okay, I can't tell if this is doing anything or not. And of course, IBM's well-documented motto is think. And I know this from this photograph, of course, but I also know it because growing up, my father had that same think plaque mounted over his desk, both at home and in the office. I think at home, ironically, but I never was really 100% sure if he meant it ironically or not. And I remember as a child just being fascinated by the idea of, having this kind of governing motto that would kind of shape your thought. Like if you weren't thinking, here's a reminder to be doing it. And so most of my work falls under the kind of category header of being a Volksboutique project. And Volksboutique has kind of in a way become my think motto. It refers to my studio, it refers to a series of works that I'm going to show you pictures of, and it also originally has its name from a second-hand shop that I ran in Berlin in 1995 to 1997, which was called the Volksboutique. To give a little tiny bit of backstory, I graduated from art school in Baltimore, Maryland, and in 1991, and I 2 weeks later found myself living in Berlin Mitte, 2 years after the reunification. But actually, anyone who might have been there or might have been reading about it since, it was a pretty rowdy time in Berlin in the early 90s. And so arriving there, there was a posse of people like myself who kind of came to see what it was like to kind of colonize the post-socialist state that had been left by the GDR. And if you've been to Berlin recently, it's become a very kind of lovely, somewhat gentrified, beautiful urban environment. But in the early 90s, it was much more kind of raw, very unconnected, and very kind of isolated space. But at the same time, there were a lot of kind of strange possibilities for living that don't generally exist here now. And so a lot of the people working at that time, we were all living basically on top of the removed GDR. And this meant quite literally that when the wall was opened in this kind of spectacle on television in 1989, a great deal of residents in Berlin especially didn't really buy the whole idea that it was staying open. And so people very kind of surreptitiously just packed a bag, took their families, and walked through and left their entire lives behind them, assuming that the wall would then be resealed and they'd be on the other side. And so people like myself moving in 2 years later were happy to find that entire homes were left behind, were still empty, and that the government was still reeling so severely from the bureaucratic process of the reunification, the political process, that minutia like figuring out who left their homes and what to do with them was really the last thing on their minds. And so it was this very strange time where all these kind of new settlers moved in and were living in other people's living environments for quite a long time. Similarly, a lot of East Germans who stayed kind of enacted this kind of East purge, and they would just kind of throw all of their stuff out on the streets. And so it was completely normal to be walking around and find fully functioning typewriters, washing machines, appliances, huge bags of clothes in multitude, because all of these people decided every item of their daily use that had an East label to them, a lot of them find it totally abhorrent and just cast it out. And so there were people like me recollecting this stuff and kind of making their living environment out of it. Also, Volksboutique gets its name from the East German industry, which was called the Volkseigenen which roughly translates to kind of the people's own industry. And this refers to a production plant that was pretty much responsible for most of the daily use material in Eastern Germany. Things like towels, mustard, candles, stationery, small household products would all be on the back labeled with this stamp that said VEB, Volkseigenen Betrieb. And it became a really kind of easily recognizable symbol in the city that something was of that. And there was very little option. So you had a very kind of specific aesthetic that completely contrary to the American, system of it's not just good to have one type of thing, you should have all different types of the same type of thing. And so in East Germany, it was a pretty single option shopping environment. And I remember encountering, while I was living there, kind of depots where all of the stuff had been stored and was being kind of either thrown out or sold for ridiculously low prices. And like a package of mustard was like in a little tiny paper Dixie cup full of mustard with a little piece of paper over it wrapped in a rubber band. And this was like for sale in a grocery store. And so I remember just being completely fascinated and charmed by this entire method of production, or this idea that people's lives were being kind of stocked in such in a non-machine produced environment, and that there was something kind of ridiculous about the Volkseigenen Betrieb, but at the same time kind of honest and humble at this, in a kind of approach to furnishing everybody's lives with the things they needed. So as a way to give you some background, I'd been living in Berlin in the early 90s and was doing a series of works where when I first arrived, I neither spoke the language, I had absolutely no permission to be in Germany, and I didn't really have any kind of social setup. And so I was much more active with setting those, solving those problems than with continuing any, studio work that I'd been doing as an art student. And so very quickly, however, I started thinking about projects that would kind of mesh the two agendas together. And so I was doing a series of projects that I loosely refer to as work pieces, where I would apprentice a certain kind of job that I could do for money in Berlin, but at the same time could recontextualize as an art experience. And the most popular of those was working as a masseuse. And so I had apprenticed with a masseur in Berlin, and I was literally going door to door, kind of going into office buildings and going to people's houses working as a masseuse, because it was something I could do with very little language knowledge. It was something I didn't need any real room, tools, etc., and I could do it for like kind of tips under the table. And this very quickly kind of spoke itself around the some part of the art world, and I started getting invited to all sorts of group shows all over Europe to do this. And so I was kind of being exported around from Berlin to perform sort of strange service interventions in various group shows, which is documented somewhat. I'm sure by now the book Relational Aesthetics by Nicolas Bourriaud has made it over here. And he speaks a lot about kind of social artists who are involving these kind of interventions into social sphere. And so these pieces I felt were they were very effective, and for me it was kind of like all of a sudden I had this service that people were willing to pay me for to enact. At the same time, however, it was making my life very transient, and so I started thinking about ways to relocate myself in Berlin full time, and so I basically kind of wanted to invert the thing that was happening. Rather than sending myself out, I wanted to be able to bring people in. And so in 1995 and the beginning of 1996, I started working on what I thought at the time was a sort of thesis project that was going to try to encapsulate the 5 years that I'd been living in Berlin at that point and kind of pay homage to it and be a sort of kind of small museum to what I felt that experience had been. And that was a project I ended up calling the Volksboutique, which is a term I coined. It roughly translates to the people's boutique. It takes the German term Volk, the people, which is a pretty loaded term that I actually felt pretty strongly about in a socialist sense, and the fact that in the GDR it had been used in a particular way that was very contrary to National Socialism. And I wanted to kind of also take that very kind of extremely large word in that society and butt it up against a kind of very American or kind of more consumer concept, which was the boutique. And so the idea was to also furnish myself with a full-time occupation in the form of this shop. And so I opened the Volksboutique in September of 1996 and really just was completely immersed with the idea that every aspect of running a small kind of, humble shopping environment would be my full-time artistic occupation. And so it was things like being concerned with inventory, finding people to donate clothes, decorating, advertising, planning events that would kind of generate publicity for the space, figuring out how, there was very little overhead possible. I didn't have any money, but I was still trying to figure out how I would be able to earn my living from this. And so there was this kind of backwards operational budget going on, and that everything was donated, and I was just literally expending a great deal of labor trying to get other clothing stores to give me hangers. The clothing rods were the gas pipes that were no longer in use, and I had ads in every newspaper in Berlin asking for clothing donations. And it was this kind of interesting experiment in meeting other people that, for example, I'm asking people to give me clothing so that I can sell it and keep the money. And people thought this was a great idea. People would be like, oh, come on in, and I was having tea with people, and oh, it's so nice. And they would ask me to kind of sign something in case it was, important later. And it was this very strange kind of, as soon as they knew that I had an art agenda, it became very fascinating to them. And they were really excited to be part of it. And so my idea was to try to see how involved an audience, people either contributing to the running of the shop or people visiting it as consumers, how involved that audience can actually be in the work, and what it's like to try to run something that is that encompassing and that is so much about how I'm living my life and how they're living their lives, and at what kind of point of exchange or point of, in this case, like a shop space, things intersect. And this is the workspace of the Volksboutique in the back. And so people also had a nice glimpse into like how I was spending my day-to-day activity. They would kind of be able to mill about. And it was a very, kind of casual, some people were in shopping, some people would bring their friends and sit down and have tea and hang out. Some people would, assist me stuffing envelopes or, designing flyers or whatever. And I was really kind of very satisfied with this idea that I'd kind of taken myself out of an artificial system, maybe the art system, and put myself into what I really felt was a very important aspect of my own life and life in Berlin Mitte at that time. The area that the Volksboutique is seated in was pretty important in terms of a lot of squatted house projects, impromptu restaurants, galleries, a lot of spaces that were literally just forming really kind of way under the radar of anything official in the city. And so it seemed like a very fitting place to be producing a project like this. Interestingly, the shop had been open like a month and a half, and I was just getting my feet wet, and there was a visit from the entire curatorial team of Documenta 10, which was being curated for the next year in 1997. Documenta is one of the larger kind of comprehensive visual art exhibitions. It happens in Germany, in Kassel, Germany, every 5 years, and it's pretends to be a kind of best of contemporary art survey showing about 100 artists working at the time, and it's a pretty large event. And so when they walked in, I remember thinking like, wow, they must be lost, or it was the kind of thing where the entire curatorial team was, they were very visible, they were in the paper all the time. And they kind of sat down, started looking at clothes. We got talking, and they were like, great, why don't you bring this down to Kassel, and, we'll set it up at Documenta 10. And I remember as they left thinking, whoa, I mean, it was a really kind of strange, unexpected kind of event for what, pretty much the opposite of what I had planned. But the more I started thinking about it, I started realizing that, well, this is what should happen, right? I mean, this thing should just be kind of franchised out, and it'll kind of like explode, and I'll be setting up these little kind of boutique spaces anywhere someone will let me. And so I did participate in Documenta 10, which was in summer of 1997, with a second Volksboutique, which I was calling the franchise, housed in a former dry cleaners in an underground passageway linking one museum in this town to another museum. This space had been it had said the dry cleaner in Kassel with the special service, and now it says Volksboutique in Kassel with the special service. It was an interesting event. This show had the goal of really integrating the city into the exhibition. I mean, this is a pretty museum-based exhibition. It's, hundreds of artists, 5 major museums, many smaller spaces, but the curator's attempts to get the artist to actually leave the museum and go somewhere else in the city were not that well met by most of the artists. I mean, in the end, most artists were like, yeah, no, I want to be in the museum. And so there were only a number of us who actually kind of spread out, and I remember in my case, I was saying to them, well, I need a shop space. It should have a big picture window, it should have heat, it should it'd have running water, that's pretty much it. And in the end, there ended up being a kind of interesting showdown between myself and a video artist. And the video artist wanted to basically darken the entire space and put a video monitor on a plinth in the room and show it through the shop window. And it was a pretty interesting experience for me, sitting there going, well, I need a shop. I need to run a fully functioning clothing shop. And this guy's like, well, I need a display window. And we were having this kind of argument, which seemed completely nonsensical to me in the larger picture of it, but I'm sure not to him. In the end, I persevered and ended up taking over the shop space. And so for 100 days in 1997, I was running both of these shops simultaneously in Berlin and in Kassel and commuting between the two of them. And so I was getting a pretty interesting perspective shift in what it's like to run the shop in Berlin, which is the city that I was living in, where I know a lot of people, where on a nice day, 20 people would come into the store and we would hang out and have biscuits and try on clothes and talk about the weather. And on a pretty average day in Kassel, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people would be coming by the shop because of the kind of magnet appeal of that exhibition in Germany. It is definitely, for people who are even kind of vaguely interested in contemporary art, many people in all over the world buy a ticket to Documenta and go check it out. And they also go with a very interesting perspective. They've paid money to go in, and so they want to be entertained, but at the same time they're kind of skeptical. And so people, especially presented with my project, were fairly kind of, they weren't sure if I was really in the show, and whether or not I was in the show seemed to make a difference to them in terms of whether they thought the project was interesting. The fact that I was selling things for money seemed to be a little bit of an issue to people. That there were a couple of comments, or there were many comments, that Documenta was not a commercial exhibition, and therefore how dare I be making money, and that would kind of launch a discussion about how we recognize a commercial exhibition or a commercial art opportunity, and whether or not the prices hanging on the work really means it's commercial or not. There were a lot of discussions, obviously, and discussions about the whole economy of being an artist, and about it seemed to be like, I would say the general myth would be that being an artist is reward enough, so making money off of it seems to be like a little too much, or a little bit more than they bargained for. And also there were a lot of people quite surprised that I actually was manning this project, that at a level of this sort of exhibition, it would have been completely expected that some assistant or some gallery, someone hired from the gallery would be sitting in there kind of maintaining everything. I think people were genuinely surprised to kind of find the artist at work in the work. And this whole experience of running both of these projects simultaneously really gave me the opportunity to learn a lot about what I was trying to generate from an artwork, or what I expected from an artwork, what I felt an audience expected from it, what I felt I was getting right, what I felt might be something that was not clear to people. It enabled a really kind of direct dialogue between myself and people, which I felt any kind of fabricated object I might have been able to make or render wouldn't have had that transportive effect. And if you can see from the pictures too that I was much more interested in kind of recontextualizing existing objects, things that I'd found in East German depots or things that I'd collected on the street, and kind of just reorganizing them in a way to tell people that you don't have to appreciate something as an artistic event just because it's been made by the artistic hand, but you can also appreciate it just because the way you're looking at it has somehow now shifted. One of the more interesting aspects of Documenta 10, of course, was also that the profile of the show was very high. The press about it was very comprehensive. And so it enabled me all of a sudden, this project that I had initially kind of started very open-ended, thinking I'm going to do this until something else, suddenly, and I had conceived it as a kind of, closure to an experience. I'd been doing these projects that were very much about work and about investigating what the role of an artist is and figuring out what are the skills or the tasks that are inherent to this occupation. And suddenly the project that was meant to be a kind of, closing statement was kind of looking like a launch pad, where it seemed like there was so much interest in this project, and in a very kind of, exciting way, but in also kind of very expected way, there was quite a lot of interest in showing the Volksboutique after Documenta in all sorts of new contexts. I mean, I got invited to Fashion Week at Milan and all galleries in Japan and galleries in Russia. And suddenly I was kind of overwhelmed by the idea that it was great to have opportunity because, what does a young businesswoman want but opportunity? But at the same time, the idea of just kind of moving this clothing store around from art space to art space, or cities where I had absolutely no language knowledge or absolutely no real connection to anything going on in those cities, seemed kind of a misunderstanding of the project. And that for me to be able to, I don't necessarily approach any of these projects now as sociological projects per se, but there is something to be said that if I'm going to be designing something for a specific audience, then I have to really understand where I'm going. And so for me, the idea to just move this project around as a sculpture or as a fixed installation didn't seem so helpful. And so instead, I started thinking about what ways I could determine to retain the idea of the Volksboutique and expand it at the same time, and figure out what the aspects of it were that I was trying to show people, and just continue to change the form so that the form might be more correct in different audiences in different situations. And the first the next project of a similar scale was made in New York in 1999 after an invitation from Public Art Fund, who make kind of large-scale public sculpture projects in outdoor public work in New York City. And the project that I was proposing to them was a little bit more performative than they had usually done, but for me it was also a pretty interesting way of being able to retain and at the same time expand some of the ideas of Volksboutique. And that project was running a fully functioning tour guide agency out of a gallery space in Lower Manhattan. That was also quite interesting. I had actually arrived in New York in 1998 because following Documenta, the Berlin Cultural Council decided to award me the Berliner Art Prize to be a Berlin representative at PS1 Contemporary Art Center, which is in New York. And there was for me, a kind of intriguing moment that I had gone to Berlin to sort of assimilate myself into the city and become a practicing artist in that city. And in 6 years, I was being sent back to New York to kind of be like, well, go be a Berliner in New York now. And it seemed like a very kind of round thing that was happening, but a little bit disorienting as well. I wasn't sure if I'd been kind of like knighted with like an official, like, you are a Berliner, now go out, child, or if they were like, enough of this, go home. And in any case, I found myself in New York where I hadn't previously lived. And so, like many people, I was just walking around, getting a feel of the city and being kind of overwhelmed after living in Berlin in the early 90s, which was a very distinct and rather spare aesthetic environment, being suddenly in the middle of New York in like the go-go 90s. It was like everybody was like working in some internet company and everybody had all this money and there was cell phones a-peeping and everyone was running off to check their email every time. And this was such a hugely different experience than the one I'd been living in, where, in Berlin Mitte, they didn't install a citywide phone network until like 1996. And so it was completely normal to be living there and not have any use of a phone at all. And so people just kind of compensated by, carrying around notepads everywhere. And if you came home and there were 6 notes on your door, you would just kind of transcribe the notes and the deadlines into your calendar and be like, okay, dinner's on Thursday at 8, and this was just the way things were done. So coming into New York, I had definite culture shock coming back into America. And so I was starting to try to think about how to sort through that, and also to devise a project that would both continue the Volksboutique, but at the same time address what was then my contemporary situation. The idea with Tour Guide was to also set up an economically viable, functioning business that would incorporate, a sort of, behind the scenes. This is the office of the project, and then there would be a sort of display, which was the actual physical walking tour that people were going on. And the curation of the walking tour was intended to, give people a glimpse into something that they might not be able to access. Anyone can go to New York and figure out where the Empire State Building is or where the Statue of Liberty is, and you don't necessarily need a guide to show them to you. A lot of the walking tours in New York City, and I have been on them all, there's specialized tours that are like food tours. There are religious tours. There are, famous writer tours and places where people have done famous things or famous people have died famously somewhere. And so my idea was to show people a kind of counterculture wouldn't be a word that would really do it service, but I took people into small businesses that were run in a kind of mom and pop way with kind of particularly intriguing interiors. I took them into the holding facility called the Tombs, a jail facility in Lower Manhattan, and introduced them to all the guards. There was also an interesting, one of the guards would tell a story about how prisoners could smuggle razor blades into the facility. And so it was, always kind of like a captive audience with this like bored security guard explaining to the tour, various kind of shenanigans going on the part of the inmates. We went to a homeless men's shelter called the Joseph McCauley Mission and got a tour of that facility. There's a lot of famous or kind of rumored tunnel systems in New York City for all various purposes besides the subway tunnels. And one was rumored to go from the former police station on Lafayette behind to what is now an Irish bar, but at the time had been a brothel. And there was all this rumor that, dignitaries would enter the police building at night for work, and then they would kind of disappear into the tunnel and show up in the brothel. And as I was discussing that possibility with the tour, the owner of the Irish bar was like, oh, well, actually, that tunnel exists, and I can take you into it. And so we had like gone into this guy's pub down into the basement and like found this tunnel back to the police facility. I think the best part of the tour for me was the idea was to kind of set up this system of planned hits and then hope for some sort of other revelatory experience that might be more worth it, or just kind of like an accident that the whole group happened to stumble upon. And the best one definitely was walking by a freight elevator that was shut, and then as we walked by, the doors suddenly burst open with such a theatricality that everyone just kind of stopped and leaned back to look into the elevator just kind of automatically. and noticed that the entire elevator shaft on the floor was completely collaged with images. And so we kind of stepped in, and the elevator driver, Henry, was like, "Oh, have you not seen my gallery?" And he had been working in this elevator shaft for 18 years, and he had a freight elevator that had no sides to it. And so an 8-story shaft, he'd been collaging it thematically. So he had the landscape floor, and he had the nudes, and he had the Keen, like the big baby doll eye floor like that. And I mean, it was pretty impressive, and so the whole group was just kind of being lifted up in this elevator, watching this little moving museum with this small Puerto Rican man going like, "And here I've been working a little bit here on the trees." And so it was that sort of event that I was trying to get people to see and hoping for every time the tour went out. So similarly, being in New York, there was quite a lot of, I would be working in the office with the shades down at night, doing paperwork or something. And I would hear people outside saying, "Oh yeah, it's this artist, and she just sits in there and pretends to be a tour guide, but she doesn't really go anywhere. And, it's just about, pretending to do something, And then I would have to always kind of interrupt and say like, "No, actually, it's a little bit more labor intensive than that. Actually not really trying to." I constantly run into this kind of situation where people are accusing me of scamming something or kind of trying to pull one over, and then I'm saying, "No, actually, I'm really trying to do something actually very straightforward, and you're the ones who, have the idea of like pulling the wool over the public's eyes in your heads. It's not me trying to pull it over on you. It's like you feeling like you're on the defense of something." And so I like the projects kind of breaking down that idea. I'm actually, the computer's going ahead. I will back up here a minute and show or point your attention to, I don't know if you can see this, but next to the shelf in the middle are 3 framed photographs, and the middle one is a portrait of myself with Conan O'Brien, the late night talk show host. This doesn't necessarily merit mention in a lecture on my work, but one of the sub-projects I decided to occupy myself with in New York when I first arrived was I thought, if New York is the city of ambition, then I needed some kind of ambitious task that I should try to accomplish when I get there that would make me feel like I'd been initiated. And so I decided the task was going to be to meet and have a conversation with Conan O'Brien. And I'd gotten kind of interested in Germany. I didn't watch hardly any television at all, and I certainly wasn't paying attention to American television. But a couple times in hotel rooms, I had encountered Conan O'Brien on MSNBC, and I was always kind of intrigued by the whole job, the whole job of late night television. I thought he was a particularly good example of someone who's basically saddled with the task of whomever he's talking to, he's trying to get the meat out of it and be like, it can be a model going, "Yeah, and then I was in Egypt, and and then I was not in Egypt, and then I was in Israel, and then I wasn't there anymore," and he's just trying to make it seem compelling to another audience. And so in New York, I'd put up posters all over saying that I was interested in meeting Conan O'Brien, if anyone could facilitate it, to call a number. And so someone called and said, "Oh, I'm actually photographing Conan O'Brien for Rolling Stone magazine. Do you want to come along?" And so I ended up getting hired as a fake assistant art director on this huge photo shoot, shooting him for a photo series in Rolling Stone. And so I was the only woman on this whole team. And so I ended up having this lengthy conversation with him and got my picture taken with him. And so very proudly, any pizzeria in New York has a picture of Robert De Niro hanging up in it, Italian people. And so I had I'm a tour guide, and I have this picture of me and a celebrity in my office. And this was, it was kind of hidden on the wall. It wasn't that prominent, but people were fascinated with the picture of Conan and I, and it was everything from "Oh, I hear he's single. I could get a number for you," or you would be really good at that. I mean, they don't have enough women in those jobs. Or, you're so good at talking. I mean, all he does is talk. You could talk too. And so I started feeling that almost like a lot of the people who were visiting the tour were seeing where this should go maybe a little bit better than I was. And so I decided to see actually what it would be to kind of take on a job like the job that Conan O'Brien has. Also because I was starting to get interested, or I was starting to get feeling a little bit pigeonholed by the idea that a Volksboutique project was an inherently service-oriented project, or the idea that it was a menial service, that I was getting get a lot of exhibitions suggesting work to me, like, how about, you come to our museum and do this? And I was starting to think, this isn't like art to order or something. Like, you don't get to just decide what I'm going to do and I'll come and do it for you because you think it's in the line of what I'm doing. And so I started thinking, well, I've obviously got to take much more concrete steps to delineate what it is I'm doing. And so the project, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back there. The project, the third larger project in the Volksboutique line was called Pilot. This is a promotional shot. This is, if you go to the NBC store in New York, you can go to the NBC Experience and have yourself photographed on any of the sets. This is just a blue screen, right? So they just drop you into a set. This was the first set of the Conan O'Brien show. And the gentleman to my right in this photograph is a Brooklyn-based artist called Dave Herman, who, for the Pilot, was functioning as the sidekick to the show. So the basic idea here was to conceive of a completely functioning late-night television talk show within a gallery situation that at the beginning of the gallery was completely not started, and by the end of the gallery exhibition was to the point of taping, and then there would be a live taping. And so it became kind of a signature project in the fact that it was this idea of taking on this huge mouthful of a project, performing it in public so that everyone was kind of aware of the day-to-day progress, and not really necessarily being 100% sure that one had the tools with which to execute it, but kind of going for it anyway. And so, for example, this is the set of Pilot at the very end of this exhibition. During the entire exhibition, this whole room was a construction site for most of the time. So anyone who would come in would see things being measured, backdrops being hung up on the back of the wall, people arguing over wood size, us walking around trying to see where everything was going to go, trying to figure out how to install a lighting grid in a gallery that didn't have the space for one, trying to decide if a bleacher system that was supposed to hold 250 people would end up collapsing through the floor of the gallery. A lot of kind of basic installation art-related worry. And in the second room of the gallery, they would encounter the production office. Obviously, they wouldn't encounter us posed in both of those spaces simultaneously. And this was, another kind of back room of a Volksboutique project where they would see myself and, in this case, Dave Herman. This is also, these photographs are exceptionally cleaned up. I mean, this project at the nexus of this project, there were about 46 people working on it. And so there were writers, there were light people, camera people, gallery people, interns, people painting things, people installing things, people trying to figure out who the guests were going to be on the show. And myself and Dave Herman were kind of steering this whole project, thus the name Pilot. And also, obviously, because we were making a sort of first episode of this talk show. The pilot episode. And so the idea was basically to just work towards this goal of filming this show and then have a live studio taping of the show at the end of it to show an audience. And so I don't really, my goal here wasn't necessarily to make a video, and so I don't really show the video. The video is actually very realistically framed like you see any of these talk shows. I mean, it is structured the exact same way. It has commercial breaks at the exact same spots. I spent a year in between the tour guide project. One of the people who attended the tour guide project was actually a writer for the Conan O'Brien show, and so he'd kind of given me this access to the Conan O'Brien show, where I think at the end, Conan himself must have been like, the brunette chick is back again. I can't, like he must have been kind of creeped out that I was always kind of like glued to the wall of their show, just watching how sets are built, watching how the guests are funneled behind the backstage, watching what all the people with clipboards are actually doing, what it says on their clipboards, and just trying to move that over into my own project. And so what I'm interested in showing in terms of the actual taping of the show was all of that exterior work, and it's things like the set manager doing this, while the show was going on, guests kind of waiting in the wings, kind of swinging their arms, makeup lady coming in every time I was off camera and kind of repowdering me. And so the idea was to just kind of show that plethora of stuff going on. And it was also a pretty interesting energy captured in the gallery space, because everybody who was in this audience who'd been kind of invited or kind of picked by a raffle that was running during the time of the show were probably also thinking, oh man, I hope this works out, as they really might not know what they're doing, and it could be really excruciating for everyone. But in the end, it was this very kind of heroic feeling, because we managed to pull off a fairly realistic, though, completely unstudied version of a late night television talk show. And it kind of was a success, and so everyone kind of exhaled, as a group in the whole room, like, whew, thank God that all. And so it was interesting that the audience, even though they were sitting back and they were actually really not implicated, they somehow were. They somehow felt like, they had something riding on this whole project, as did we. Also, the guests that were interviewed on this show, one was a marriage arranger called Dan Field, who's one of the oldest working primarily Jewish clientele marriage arrangers working out of Times Square, who started off I said, well, my God, you're so impressive, I don't know where to start. And he said, well, I will start. I can tell the whole story, and he just kind of launched into like the history of his business. And another one of the guests was a perfume, she was called a scent consultant from Bloomingdale's, excuse me, and these are the people who spray you with perfume when you walk through the perfume department. But you're no longer allowed to do that because people started suing. And so you're required now to spray the scent on a piece of paper and consult someone by handing it to them like a business card. And so I loved the idea that this woman's job, and she was really kind of a live wire. I mean, she was much more animated than one might have thought having a job. Well, having a job like that, it's kind of a face-forward type of job. So I was very interested in basically, similar to the tour, like kind of presenting the talk show audience with these type of characters, and I really love the fact that these projects start becoming kind of, collection tanks for kind of all sorts of people kind of wandering in. If you do a project like the tour guide project in New York City, you meet a lot of people who profess to be New York City, they know it all, and so you get a lot of people coming down going, oh yeah, you're going to show them this, you're going to show them that, and so it becomes a pretty interesting social experiment. It was also at the time of the pilot show that I started reconsidering what these are that I'm making. They were Volksboutique projects, but I also realized that they were getting described, especially in kind of art press or by critics, either as installation art, which is not necessarily false, but I felt that the naming installation art was kind of not paying attention to a very undeniable live aspect of some of this work, and the kind of people and persona in the work being very integral to it, and that was not being really addressed in the term installation art. Where that is addressed, of course, is the term performance art. But I definitely have the experience personally that if you are introduced to someone at a party as being a performance artist, they've already imagined you naked and on fire or like running through a theater. And so I felt like this was a term that really wasn't doing service to the work that I was trying to make. And so I started calling the projects organizational ventures, which I felt was more an apt description of the fact that there is a huge amount of kind of behind the scenes, some made public, some not, research aspect to the work, bureaucratic aspect to the work, huge administrative duties that most artists are familiar with but don't necessarily tend to put forward in their work. Obviously, the venture aspect of it is that these become these like small entrepreneurial undertakings where I'm either trying to make a living, I'm trying to set up a business, I'm trying to get people involved, I'm trying to advertise, and so I felt like that term was much more kind of appropriate for describing these sorts of kind of larger scale, longer term projects. So at this point, I'd pretty much established also a workspace in Brooklyn, New York, since I was doing a lot of projects in the United States. And so I started thinking about what that project is and what the workspace was for. Unlike the Volksboutique shop or any of these projects, it's not necessarily publicly accessible. It's not on ground level. It's not open, at any kind of regular time. And so I started calling it the products division of the Volksboutique. And so I started making some products to come out of the products division. This is the first one. It's because I started getting fascinated with the whole idea that all of these projects are being steered from a desk. And I think now it's kind of, no secret that a lot of artwork is actually desk work that's being kind of either made on a computer, or it's a lot of just thinking about things or deciding things. And I liked the idea that I actually had a desk job somehow. And so I was thinking of other ways to manifest that. Also that some of the exhibitions I get invited to, I can't physically be in them for a month, if they're 4 months long, or if they're in places that I can't get to. And so I was trying to think of some way to send a representative ahead of myself. And so the first product from the products division is the Volksboutique handbag. It's kind of a little portable office. I'm definitely the type of person who carries a small arsenal of, urban survival gear with me, lest I be trapped somewhere bored and have nothing to kind of distract myself with, and I'm sure most people now do that. So I made my own version of it. And like we know, Joseph Beuys also wore a handbag, to protect himself. And so the idea was to make this kind of usable product. And also one of the really important ideas was to learn how to do this. I did not just kind of delegate this to a museum and let them work out the details. I got hopelessly enmeshed in trying to get a handbag fabricated in New York City minus a sweatshop. And it turns out you have to hire what's called a fashion consultant. And this is basically the middleman between you and the people who are doing all the work. And so it became this kind of very layered process of trying to get this thing made to my specifications, never getting to actually talk to the person who was going to make it. And so now you see the handbag in some of its environments. That's kind of that is the museum environment, and this is the street environment. That is a no comment image. So similarly, I started thinking about, as a kind of smaller version of some of these larger projects, to think about projects that are much more easily portable. It's interesting we were talking about getting stuff onto planes, because this project was this is another kind of portable office kit, and the idea originally was that I needed something that I could take into airplanes very easily, and so this was sized perfectly to be taking into an airplane, but I was not anticipating the post-September 11th, airport mania that is now happening. So this is not as easily executed as it once was. This is a completely hand custom fabricated suitcase that carries a complete little kind of printing apparatus. It has a set of stamps in various sizes. It has a tip jar, which is what you see at the top corner there. Volksboutique memorabilia, a camera to take pictures of people I encounter. The two books that are mounted on the top are actually anecdote books. And the idea initially was, in New York it's very popular to have people setting up on the street, to inscribe your name in a grain of rice, or to paint your name in rainbow butterfly script, or to do all sorts of kind of strange, impromptu innovations. And so my idea was to make people custom kind of memento posters on site. I get invited despite the fact that I'm no longer a performance artist, I get invited to a lot of performance art type of things where there's no installation. And so I invented this kit to kind of go out on the road with me, and it becomes this kind of hawking my wares type of exchange with the audience. And that's what you get at the end. It's funny because I charge per letter, and this is an actually pretty laborious process. And some people really, really overestimate my own printing capabilities. I've had people lay down lyrics to some song that they want printed on a thing that are literally pages long, and I'm saying this will take me 5 hours to get this finished, and they're like, oh, is that a problem? So it becomes an interesting kind of like meet me halfway type of experience with people. Like, I'm giving you something, you know, that's made by my hands, so don't take advantage of me. Fast forwarding a little bit, Organizational Ventures was treated to a 3-museum kind of, I don't know if retrospective is really the right word, but it was kind of an overview of projects in Europe in 2001 and 2002. And so I had this opportunity to kind of manifest a lot of the projects at the same time in museum space, and was starting to think more concretely about how these projects are set up and how they get designed. And I was also using each museum as a kind of workshop to set up a project for the next museum. So I had this idea that, you know, there would be this pyramid scheme of unending projects, that each museum would function as a kind of workspace for the next, and this could kind of go on forever. And so these are just a few pictures that I won't say too much about. They just show various museum environments that are showcasing some of these projects. As you can see, for me too, it's like I'm pretty interested in specific types of space, and so being confronted with like a hall like this is the Migros Museum in Zurich. You know, this is kind of like, you know, having an exhibition in an airplane hangar. I mean, it's this enormously white blank space. And so I was just kind of thinking about ways to kind of subdivide, and so I kind of came up with this own like Volksboutique trade show kind of environment that, you know, everything would have its own kind of like little subdivision, and all the projects, you know, there'd be a little tea cozy in the back where you could kind of sit down and rest, and, you know, a lot of ephemera from the projects. Because I really feel that one thing that kind of worries me about the projects is that I never, for me, pretty much everything that comes up is included in these projects. And so I always publish a sort of like an ingredients list at the end of these projects, and these lists are pretty long. And so I always feel that people walking into the show sometimes don't even know where to focus, because there's a lot of stuff to look at, and there's like pencils on desks and faxes in the garbage and people talking and, you know, TVs running and all sorts of things. And I kind of also feel that that kind of mass is something that I'm trying to kind of confront people with, and then trying to whittle that down into a cohesive museum presentation always kind of presents me with a little bit of a conundrum, because I'm not really sure where I want to, you know, where I want to kind of draw the line at what's in and what's out. This is incidentally the pilot project was archived, and so every single paper project or paper piece that went into that show ended up getting fitted into, this is a 1920 steamer trunk that I bought on eBay, and basically all of the drawers have now become like little kind of customized file boxes, and on the other side you see like the costumes and stuff from it. This is just another space. This is the ICA in Leipzig. This is also, I don't have any close-up pictures of this, but this is a glimpse of the Volksboutique reference library reading room that, as I was thinking of things like having portable, you know, publishing kits and things that I could kind of take on the road, I also started thinking about all of the other kind of material inherent to a project like this, and definitely having my own reference library kind of felt like, you know, kind of sell my own National Geographic sets to people or something. And so I made a 10-volume, it's an edition of 10, and there are 10 volumes in each set. And it's a kind of non-narrative, mostly picture archive of imagery that I find that is Volksboutique specific, not necessarily images of mine, but you know, things that I find are relevant to kind of understanding that project. I have a pretty substantial collection of encyclopedia and reference books myself, and a lot of children's manuals and encyclopedia, so I kind of base them on that a lot. So, alluding to collecting, I do maintain a pretty enormous archive at this point, both of stuff that is relevant to my own work, but I also tend to collect. I think watching the culture of East Germany slowly, first it was first it was kind of everywhere, and then it was on the street, and then it was in depots and the sides of the streets, and then suddenly it was just vanishing. And I started realizing that I remember going into a museum in Berlin, and they had kind of dioramas of like the German kitchen from like 1878 to modern day. And when they got to like, you know, the 70s in the GDR, the kitchen was the exact same kitchen that I had recreated in my kitchen in Berlin, because I had been gathering everything off the street and putting it in my house. And I remember thinking, you know, oh, you know, like this stuff is now in a museum. It's not going to be, you know, at hand for much longer. Similarly, you know, I'm coming to New York, and there's a very distinct kind of whitewashing of stuff going on. And so I started getting really obsessed with collecting endangered environments, or collecting endangered materials that I felt were no longer going to be, you know, sustained in the culture beyond me. And I don't have a picture of this, but an example of projects like that is that I was a patron of a very specific stationer store in Lower Manhattan for years, and was very good friends with the proprietor, who then decided to retire and close the store. And you know, this kind of was panic for me. And so he and I ended up cutting a deal with each other that if I would help him liquidate the entire business, and he would give me his inventory that was left over, minus things like his computers and his Xerox machine, which I wasn't interested in anyway. This is also interesting that his business was housed in the ground floor of a building that is owned and occupied by Christo and Jean-Claude. And so they were going to take over the space again and, you know, use it for storage. And so Jean-Claude and I met at the dumpster the day of the liquidation, and we're kind of like arguing over material. And luckily the guy came out and was explaining to us, like, ladies, let's not fight. You know, Christine, she has interests, she wants to have these, and Jean-Claude, she obviously wants to have these things. It was kind of weird, like, art showdown at the dumpster between, like, the big art meets the kind of, you know, scrappy art. It was a pretty interesting situation for me to be in. However, I ended up taking on a huge amount of stationary inventory, and so I've been kind of using it to furnish some of the more recent projects. And for me also, obviously, the exchange with this proprietor was quite valuable, and so I was pretty interested in maintaining our relationship beyond being able to just exchange money over a counter, or like my being his consumer. And so now I've become kind of his museum. And so the first project that kind of used a lot of his stuff was called the Volksboutique Accounting Archive, and this is also something that is a kind of constant project that sometimes has a home or has a, you know, public space, and oftentimes is more kind of just relegated to shelves in my workspace. This was in a biennial in Liverpool in 2002, called the Liverpool Biennial. And this was an interesting workspace because the show was in a former schoolhouse, and it was beautiful. And when I got a phone call as I was arriving, and they were saying, don't worry, we've emptied the schoolhouse. There's absolutely nothing left. It looks great. And I walked into what really looked like a biennial, or like a blank, you know, gallery space. And I thought, like, oh my God, what have you done with all the school stuff? And they said, well, it's all in the basement. And so I basically just spent all the rest of the time resuscitating all the stuff from the basement and bringing it back up to populate this thing that became a manifestation of a Volksboutique archive. And the idea here is that myself, or the woman seated at the desk, who is known as the accountant, help people contribute to an archive by either lending anecdotes or lending physical objects to it. And then there's this kind of lengthy bureaucratic process that they go through to enter it into this archive. And this is a kind of interestingly maintained event that I get quite a lot of unsolicited mail at the Volksboutique Products Division, and it's based on this project. It's people submitting things for kind of inclusion in this archive. Generally, it's, by this time, people have figured out kind of running themes to Volksboutique, so I get a lot of books, reference manuals, stationery items, you know, kind of clothing oddities, etc. A lot of pictures of people's living environments. I have this kind of large collection of people's office spaces. And so without ever having really put out the public word about like what themes I was collecting to, it started developing around me anyway. And so occasionally I show manifestations of the archive to kind of show off what I've put in so far and also kind of, you know, be able to collect more stuff. In a similar vein to the reference manual, this is just the reference books. This is the style manual. Like, I started getting very interested in like the Gap style manual and Abercrombie and Fitch's style manual, which are also pretty fascist documents. You know, they explain to employees of those companies in very exacting detail what phrases may be uttered over the counter, which ones may not be uttered over the counter. Anything, like if you're familiar with the work of Carrie Young, she has an interesting piece called the Disclaimer Series. If you call a call center or you call a 1-800 number and you get patched through to like an Indian call center, anything they say that sounds like it's kind of unscripted, like, hold on, let me get that